That sounds dramatic, ladies and gentlemen, like the Titanic sinking or something like that. And it reminds to the overall topic of our discussion. Welcome to our panel, Illiberalism and Populism, the New Normal. This is quite an inconvenient question. If it is an inconvenient truth, we'll try to find out in the next 75 minutes. At least there are reasons to put this question like that. Not only that we see the rise of very self-assertive acting authoritarian powers like China, Russia, Iran, but also in more or less developed democracies, we see a kind of illiberal turn. The rise of populist forces, not only in Europe, the US, Poland, Hungary, Italy, Austria, but also in other parts of the globe, Philippines, and just yesterday in the Brazilian presidential elections, a right-wing populist candidate got almost 50% in the first round of the votes. So, what's going on? This is our first question. Are we really sliding into a new anti-liberal era, maybe comparable to the 20s and 30s of the last century? Our second major question will be, what went wrong? What went wrong with liberalism and liberal democracies? What are the root causes for this anti-liberal revolt? And the third, maybe most important question will be, what can we do, what should we do to turn the tide again and not to be too fatalistic? We are not only observers, we are actors in history. We will discuss these questions with a very interesting and sophisticated panel. I'll start with Maia Sandu. She's an economist by training, and I would say the liberal hope in Moldova. In the last presidential elections, when she was running almost out of the blue, she got 48% in the second round. Unfortunately, only 48%, but it's an astonishing result anyway. Then we have Schueftan, the director of the National Security Study Center at the University of Haifa and one of the leading security and policy experts in Israel. And last not least, of course, Zielonka. His last book of his numerous publications has the title Counter-Revolution, Liberal Europe in Retreat. So it's just to the center of our discussion, and this is why I would like to invite you, Jan, to open our conversation. Are we entering an anti-liberal era?
Let's put it like this. Populism is not new. It has been with us since democracy was born, if not earlier. What is new is that populists are winning elections.
How would you define
from one
populism?
country to another?
How would you define populism?
Well, I myself hardly ever use this word because it has become, by us liberals, a term to define those we disagree with. I therefore use the term anti-liberal politicians, or in this book I use the term counter-revolutionary, because in Europe at least, liberals were in power since the fall of Berlin Wall, if not earlier in some countries, but in entire Europe, this was the only game in town. And not only politically, but ideologically. We were able to define what is rational, what is crazy, what is normal, and what was the normal. We all believed it, that borders should be open, that we should have free trade, human rights, liberal versions of democracy, and of course European integration. And today, and we've been supported by our electorates for all these years. And today, situation has changed. More and more voters turn their back towards us and adopt and vote for people who openly claim that they are anti-liberal, that they don't believe in all that. And this is new, because Jean-Marie Le Pen won elections to French Parliament in '52. And many people in France tell me that he is much more gifted politician than his daughter, and yet she won European elections and defeated all established parties in the last presidential elections. And you can go on and on. Haider, I myself knew well Pimfort Town in Holland. So there were always politicians saying, well, we don't actually like this political correctness of liberals. But now, our electorate increasingly is voting for them. And that is the challenge many of us don't know what to do with.
So, Maia, in your perspective, would you agree that these are not just singular events or more or less accidental events, that we are facing a trend, a deeper and long-term trend in especially the Central Eastern European countries?
Well, in the case of the Eastern European countries especially, the situation is a bit different, because you asked about the definition of populism, and by political science it's the struggle between the corrupt elites and the pure people. If you take an example of a country like mine, we never had elites. Because of the transition from one system to another, we didn't manage to build elites. We just have a bunch of corrupt people.
Turn the mic a little bit deeper. Yeah. Okay.
We have a bunch of corrupt people that we are trying to take down. And if you go by this definition, the party that I represent here is an anti-system party, but it's not a populist party. It's an anti-system, which means a corrupt system, which had nothing to do with state institutions well established, that at least in the past did something well for the country, and now are doing something that the electorate doesn't want. In our case, the populism has its roots with the socialist time, because the disappointments that we've been going again and again, we've been trying to build democracy, we've been trying to build welfare for people at home, and it didn't happen, again, because of corrupt politicians. So like in my country, in Moldova, people haven't had one single positive experience with a good government they could relate to, saying, yes, democracy is good. Because after we gained independence and we're trying to build democracy, we saw some improvements, not only in terms of freedoms, because we did gain some freedoms, but also in terms of the material wealth. And because of that, it's easier for political parties to come and say, well, we can re-establish the Soviet times. We can bring you the nice, egalitarian and wealthy state for everybody. And the base of the populism is very much into this Soviet past, but also because of the failure of the post-communist governments to prove that democracy is about freedom and about prosperity.
But if you widen the objective a little bit and look to other Central Eastern European countries, in Czechia we had Václav Havel as the first president. In Poland it was the Solidarność movement taking down power after breakdown of the communist system. In Hungary, Orbán has been a liberal hopeful in his early years. So what happened? Yeah, do you see parallels between these developments?
This is a bit different, and this is why I mentioned initially that I'm talking about countries in Eastern Europe, especially former Soviet Union countries, who are still in this gray area between the West and the East, because in the Central European countries, the situation has been much better than in our countries, and you would have not expected the populism to actually appear from, not exactly from nowhere, because we have to say that there are concerns, and people do have concerns, and we have to take them seriously. But still, this is more surprising. Like, I have better explanations for countries like mine, why populism is there, and why some people are ready to give up some liberties and democracy to some extent, just because of promises that an authoritarian regime is going to meet people's material needs better than the democracy. And in countries like mine, unfortunately, you still have lots of people who believe that democracy is to be blamed for corruption, for poverty, and for migration because of the bad governments. It's a bit difficult. It's a bit different in the Central European countries and in the better off countries. And I don't have a scientific explanation, but I do hope that this is just a temporary development, and this is not going to last for a long time. But politicians do need to pay attention to this and discuss and see what should be corrected and improved.
Okay, we'll come back to that a little bit later. Dan Schueftan. Israel oftenly presents itself as the only democratic lighthouse in the Middle East. But in the last years, there had been some tendencies, in as far as I can see as a frequent visitor, that reminds me to this kind of anti-liberal swing in Europe. Yeah, you had these several attempts to brand NGOs as foreign agents, to cut international funding for I would say, the more radical wing of the peace movement. Would you agree that Israel is also part of this broader trend?
I'll come to Israel in a moment, because I think the issue at hand is very important, and Israel will be a very small part of my response. We have a crisis. I don't think it's going in a direction that is irreversible. We have a crisis. Yeah. I think that democracy and liberalism can reinvent itself, adjust to new realities. And whereas it's a serious crisis, I think we have to make a distinction here between democracy and liberalism. Liberalism is in a very bad situation. Democracy is in a bad situation. And I think the distinction between the two is very important, although in the final analysis, you must reach a marriage of the two, because only in democracy you can further liberal causes, and only a very strong, robust part of liberalism is a democracy that is worth its name. So in the final analysis...
So there is no illiberal democracy?
The question is there illiberal democracy? No. But do they call illiberal democracy something that the liberals don't like enough? Yes. Okay, so let's be careful here about the terminology. But I think that if you look at democracy and liberalism, you must look at two centers of gravity. They're different. In democracy, the center of gravity is the legitimacy of the demos. In liberalism, the center of gravity is the maximalization of human rights. And the two can work together, but they have a tension between them that is a structural tension, and that is even a healthy tension that needs to be addressed. Now, in Israel, the radical liberals have lost the confidence of the overwhelming majority of the people. And the problem in Israel is somewhat different than you have in other places. You must understand in Israel the distinction between the political system and the society. The Israeli political system is dysfunctional. Perhaps not as dysfunctional as the Americans, we are trying to learn, but it is dysfunctional. The Israeli society, on the other hand, is the eighth wonder of the world, because in spite of 140 years of war, the overwhelming majority of the Israelis are in the middle of the political spectrum, with a small left, a somewhat bigger right, and most Israelis in the middle of the political spectrum. And this is not reflected in the political system. And this is a problem perhaps we want to discuss later, but again, the issue is democracy and liberalism in Western societies. I wouldn't bring in Turkey in this category, certainly not other countries that you've mentioned here. It is a Western issue.
Yeah, I would like you to jump into that conversation. The differentiation that Schueftan made, of course, if we are following the school books, liberalism and democracy are not the same. And I remember quite well when I read the last time Carl Schmitt's famous critic on the parliamentarism. He definitely wanted to separate democracy from liberalism. And he wanted to conquer democracy for his views of a homogeneous demos, and to play it out against the liberal ideas of individual freedom, of diversity, of the protection of minority rights, even the division of powers to limit the power of the governments. What do you think of
I think it was on the first session somebody was citing this anecdote saying what is the difference between liberal democracy and illiberal, and the answer is it's like, you know, a chair and an electric chair. But I think the issue is here that the liberal democracy is not just about human rights, it's about many other things. Yeah. We call it constitutional liberalism, basically. We basically believe that power shouldn't belong to the majority of the day. That those who win, that the power has to be, first of all, divided. There should be checks and balances. That the judiciary, for instance, should be independent. But the independence should also be for the media. And that also constitutions prevents a majority of the day to take away powers of minorities. These are not just human rights. Minorities can be of very different orientation, also political. Democracy cannot function if minority, after losing elections, is just wiped out. There got to be something for them to support the winners of the elections. And this is the agreement on which democracy can function, that those who lose basically reconcile themselves because they have protection in various mechanisms which allows basically them to function as an opposition and make sure that they have a fair chance with the next election. So the liberal notion of democracy is much broader than just human rights, although I myself, I was all my life human rights campaigner, and I would not now try to disassociate myself from human rights. But it's much more. The problem, I think, of liberalism is that it was not just, partly problem of liberalism is that when liberals were in power, the balance between certain principles have been somehow broken. For instance, more and more powers have been delegated to bodies not coming from elections. right? So,
like
constitutional courts, central banks, regulatory agencies, European Commission if you are European. So the parliament, although these people won elections, made certain promises, could not really meet the promises because there was this constitutional court which told you, no, this is impossible, or central bankers would tell you. There is also more political problem here. Since markets slipped out of control of democracy, we found ourselves in this situation. Then yes, today in Italy you see it very clear. You have a new government, they made promises to do rendito di cittadinanza, which means to help people who are unemployed and to give them some cash. But immediately they are not just told by the European Commission, you cannot do this, but by the markets, because the spread between Italian and German bonds are very high. And in a way, we came to the situation that democracy became, in time, incapacitated. So, because it didn't have control on markets, markets could punish those politicians who they just didn't like. Mitterrand is a beautiful example, probably the last politician who tried to say no to the markets in early 80s, and he was immediately run over and had to change his policy 180%. And we can go further and further. I don't want to continue, but the end result was that like people from Podemos were had in their posters during demonstrations said, we have a vote, but we don't have a voice. That they felt not part of this project. They could change government, but they couldn't change policies. Mm-hmm. And all of this became very frustrated. So part of this is, of course, the way in which we understood our constraint on majority of the day institutionally. But part of the problem is, of course, the disjunction between markets and democracy.
Okay, so we are already in the midst of the debate of what went wrong with liberalism. Would you like to continue? I have some other questions.
I very strongly agree that liberalism is far beyond human rights. But when you speak, for instance, about the rights of minorities, the question always comes back to the balance. Where is the balance between the right of minorities? Remember, majorities always also have rights. This is something that some liberals have forgotten. When it comes to, for instance, you can have an independent court, but you cannot have a court that is legislating, which a lot of courts are trying to do, and unfortunately with some success. So the question is, do people who want to be represented, who want to have a voice, not only a vote, do they get enough of what will strengthen their belief in democracy? And again, without democracy, there is no liberalism, and I agree with you also, without a very strong element of liberalism, there is no sustainable democracy. So it all comes back to the balance. And the reason that I'm not so pessimistic like many others is that both Democrats and liberals and liberal Democrats have a good reason to restore a balance that was shifting in the wrong direction. What happened recently was it was shifting in the wrong direction. People lost confidence in democratic institutions and therefore turned to populists who use democracy in order to become illiberal. Okay, so there is a way of intervention here, and when we come to the question of what can we do, I will be more specific.
Maia, you are professional economist, you have been working for the World Bank. I would like you to comment a little bit on Jan Zielonka's analysis that one of the main root causes for this illiberal swing and the loss of trust into the capability of democratic institutions was this kind of running out of the global markets out of democratic control. Would you agree with this kind of analysis?
Well, I'm not exactly in the position to speak, as you said, World Bank, because this was a long time ago. I would, because this is what you mentioned, right? I dealt mainly with countries in my region, And I just want to say some things, again, which might not refer to the global situation, but which is probably more relevant to what happened in our cases. I've been working with the government, for the government since '94, so basically I've been there through transition. And I've witnessed the reforms implemented with support of IFIs, and some of them had really high social costs. And that's why at some point there was little support for these reforms, or people actually lost their hope that these reforms will improve their situation. For instance, I will not say what's the institution, but take an IFI and then they come and make these suggestions that you have to keep public spending within the limits, where you should not increase the public bill, the wage bill more than that and that. You can expect a teacher, a civil servant, a state employee to live for a salary of $200 for a year or two. You cannot expect any of these people to live for a salary of $200 per month for 30 years, because then it means that you're not taking seriously the concerns of these people. So this is just an example of the fact that there are serious concerns. And this is just a parallel with the markets which are not controlled. This is not that relevant for our part of the world, but it's an example of how we might not take seriously enough the concerns of the real concerns of people. If after 20 years you cannot find proper solutions and you keep coming with these nice policies on paper, you need to have all the macro indicators look well, and I agree with you. I mean, I agree with that. But at the same time, you can't close your eyes and not see the real issue. You can't expect a policeman not to take bribes if you pay the policeman with $100 per month and so on. So there are serious issues that at some point will become too big and then will be used by populists who would come and say, okay, enough with these liberal policies. This is the result of the liberal policies. Now we have to enforce different type of measures and solve the issues differently, not through democratic means.
I would like to deepen a little bit this conversation about the relationship between economy and politics, or between markets and democracy. I would agree that if you're looking back, which events or which crises had been a kind of catalytic factor for this illiberal turn. The financial crisis 2007-08, in my view, without doubt, has been maybe the mother of all crises, with its devastating social and economic consequences for a lot of young European countries, and with this loss of trust in the ability of democratic institutions to regulate and then control the markets. But what is the conclusion? If I am a little bit then, critical, I could hear from your argument, Jan, that we should return to, I would say, a very old-fashioned idea of national sovereignty. So what's I know this is not the answer, so what do you think about it?
Look, Ralf, first of all, there is a tendency to look at this crisis as something caused by globalization, right? Globalization, really. Globalization didn't fall from the sky. Nor did it come from China. We have deregulated and privatized everything. We've been the champions of globalization. Yes, globalization was also stimulated by technology, but those leaders of internet technologies were supported by us by means. You know, so we have to acknowledge that those things just didn't happen. Yeah. This was a policy, and this was a policy on the liberal watch. Because implications of this was not just financial crisis. Implications for this was that inequalities were tolerated or even encouraged. All the idea of competitiveness, basically justified policy being hard on poor because they are lazy, because they are, don't want to adjust themselves to the new world. And all of this has happened. So it's very difficult, Poland is a very good example because Poland, unlike Greece, economy didn't collapse. It grew 25% over the last decade. But Poland is not just champion of economic growth. It's also a champion of precariat. And each time some social policies were proposed, the government was saying, no, we cannot afford this. Like today in Italy, they say this. So what I want to say is that these were political choices, and we have to face implications for those political choices. Now, some of people say, not just Corbyn, but also in Germany, Wolfgang Streeck and others on the left, they say, okay, the solution is exactly, let's restore state capacity to regulate markets. But my answer to this is twofold. First, it's easy for a German state, which is one of the few workable states in Europe, to have an impact on those markets. Much more difficult for states such as Cyprus or Greece. I mean, I don't know whether Cyprus is a failed state, a sovereign state, and Greece, we can debate this too, right? And I don't want to offend anybody from Cyprus.
It is a harbor for Russian
I don't want to offend anybody from Cyprus, but if you are from Cyprus, you know what I mean, yeah? So those actors have much less capacity to do what would be possible in Germany. But I even don't think that in a well-functional stateless Germany this is possible, because this is simply past history. I believe that myself, that while transactions and communications are increasingly transnational, you need to restore public authority, which was destroyed, but not at the national level, but at the transnational level. You need to have a public authority at the level those transactions, financial transactions, for instance, or trade operate. But the irony of history is that at the time we need this transnational authority most, all these transnational authorities are disintegrated. It's not just the EU, but also the UN and
WTO.
Yeah, it's all just going into pieces. And here we've got a problem, and we can discuss what to do about this. But I don't believe myself that you can just go back to the future and recreate the state, because states today do not have capacity to do the things they've been able to do a century ago. And therefore, and this is last sentence, don't believe that, for instance, Keynes and his idea from century ago for the economy which was industrial will be applicable for the economy which is virtual. I believe we need to do it in a different way, but we are not there. We are still fighting the previous war.
Probably some of you have followed in my view, very interesting debate The Economist started over the last year. The Economist, you could call them the head organ of liberal capitalism over the last 150 years. And they started a very critical debate, what went wrong with liberalism. And part of it was indeed what you had been tipping on, the ignorance of liberals vis-à-vis the polarization of our societies in winners of losers, of globalization, of digital revolution, of immigration. And the lack of, I would say, efforts to steer global markets, yeah? to put in some social, ecological, whatever, framework into the global markets. I found it interesting that it came from the very heart of the liberal thinking. So do we have to reinvent liberalism?
I think the important thing, and I'm continuing on the argument you made here, is to bring back the power to the nations, not because an individual country can determine what is happening globally, but the decisions must be seen by the people as being taken in their own advantage. We have this fantasy as if there is a universal solidarity. There is no universal solidarity. At best, we can get a national solidarity. And I think that if you ask yourself, why do people say, I don't want the European Union to be involved too much in immigration issues. I don't want the UN to tell me what to do. I don't want the international courts to tell me what to do. They don't believe that there is a solidarity that goes beyond the nation. Democracy can be built in a group of solidarity where people say, I will not only seek what is immediately in my benefit, I'm willing to make concessions, but for something that I have solidarity with. For instance, the poor people of my nation, I understand, I will pay taxes and they will benefit from it. They're part of me in the final analysis. Most people don't see the world in these eyes. They don't say to themselves, I'm not saying it is justified or unjustified. I think it's justified. But they're not saying to themselves, I have an interest in all the world being in a good situation, and therefore I'm willing to give up something that is very dear to my heart for the universe. This doesn't work this way. Now, do you have elites that believe in it? Yes. Do they genuinely believe in it? Yes. Can they get enough electoral support for it in their own countries? No. And this is where the populists come in. The populists come in at the point where the elites cannot convince the people of two things. A, that they really understand their fears and their concerns. B, that they really are willing to do something effective for it. Because you have a distinction, and in my eyes, this is the curse of the modern era in the Western world, where in start asking ourselves, we're not asking what is good, but what looks good. And what looks good is very often something very bad. Because if it looks good, it is basically to make you feel good about yourself. And this is very narcissistic. And the perception of a lot of people in many democratic nations is that my elites want to feel good about themselves. They live in a modern world that they can benefit from. They know what is good for them. They don't take our concerns seriously. They're not willing to do for us what we believe should be done for us. Now, whether they're right or wrong, we can debate. But they act, and their act is to give populists their voice. So we know what they think, because populists are getting popular because people have lost the confidence in elites, because elites speak to them about universal solidarity, which doesn't exist.
Maia,
it sounds bad,
okay,
and therefore it's probably true.
Maia, would you agree that there's no solidarity beyond the nation state? And what would that mean for the project of European integration?
Well, I come from a small country, from a small nation, and for us it's a little bit more difficult not to believe in solidarity behind the border, beyond the borders, because there are so many things that we can't do by ourselves, and we need to get solidarity from outside. And we've been talking about the markets and governments who would never be able to regulate the markets, and my country is one like that. First, it doesn't have the government which would want to have proper regulation, but second, even if it has the right people there, it would never have the capacity, the resources to do this alone. So you would look at something which can be globally developed and for us just to benefit. So I'm not that sure that the issue of that there is no solidarity beyond the borders is a problem. I do agree that there is this issue of people not trusting the elites, and it's difficult to talk about elites coming from a country which has never had elites, at least in the recent history. But I do believe that there is an issue of reforms being seen, where policies being seen as technocratic and not political. And this has happened to us while we were working together with the international organizations, but more recently with the European Union, because the accent was always, the emphasis was always on the technocrats who could do the right things, and the politicians in parliament don't matter. You can have some stupid people there. It's important that you have the right people in the executive. And I have to say that my own experience, I did work as a Minister of Education for 3 years. I was appointed as a technocrat, not as a politician. I was proud that I was not a politician. I was a minister, but I didn't see myself as a politician. And I was doing all the things not without taking care of the political costs of these reforms. Later on, I realized that I have to look into this, and despite the fact that I implemented, together with my team, lots of unpopular reforms, at some point we did get the popular support. But what I'm saying, what I'm trying to say is that it's time for the technocrats, for the decent people, to become politicians as well. And for those who support our reforms, the implementation of the reforms, to understand that the reforms are political issues, not just technocratic issues. Because if you don't take it political, you're not going to explain it properly to the people, you're not going to consult enough people. Yes, it's going to be more difficult, it's easier just to do what's right without looking at the opposition that you might get from people. But these are not sustainable if you're not political in your reforms or policy implementation. So my advice would be to get more people from those who believe that they're technocrat people, experts, know very well what is to be done and so on, to become more political, because otherwise we will lose to populists.
Yeah.
Look, I agree with you that we shouldn't idolize global solidarity, but nor should we idolize national solidarity.
Why not?
Because empirically, all nations, even the most homogeneous, are divided today by ethnic cleavages, by class cleavages, by gender, and also politically in a way, because none of those, for instance, President Trump or Prime Minister Netanyahu, politically even, do not speak for the whole nation. And so that, for instance, even in a country which is, according to declaration, so religious as Poland, on the other extreme, so little religious is this country we speak from. You know, it doesn't mean that those who are religious would necessarily support policies of Catholic Church to deny women some basic rights on labor market or fertility, or that symbols of Catholic Church should be all over, and the education of religion should be at school obligatory, and that kind of things. So even when you can say there is a homogeneous nation, you see that these cleavages are very serious. So. And it's only like there is mythology of a global solidarity, there is mythology of national one. And we have to kind of, democracies about negotiating those differences and bridging those cleavages, not by imposing a mythical unity
within the national context, negotiating it,
but looking for compromises.
Yes, but within the national context.
Yes, but just a second. Wouldn't you say, or agree, Dan, that in an extremely interconnected world, economically interconnected by global migration, by technology, by, of course, politics, a certain degree of empathy with the other and a certain degree of solidarity with the other is in our enlightened interest.
Yes.
For instance, if we are looking to Europe, the stability of the other European economies is in the very interest of the German economy. No doubt about that.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think
But
we should not fall back in a kind of national thinking, which is, in my view, meanwhile, totally outdated.
Two comments. First of all, to what you said, and I, of course, agree that there are cleavages and problems, and no nation is homogeneous or should be homogeneous. I mean, we're speaking about pluralism. This is the basis of everything we're discussing here today. So it's okay when there are cleavages. The question is, if you want to regulate them, if you want to settle them, if you want to reach compromises, what is the framework within you can reach it? And to a very large extent, I wouldn't say 100%, but 90%, it is within the nation. Because the nation does not accept the legitimacy of the outside intervention to tell them what to do. I mean, look at Europe, and Europe is something cohesive. We're not speaking about global, we're speaking about people who have a lot in common. And when Angela Merkel says, you all will accept the quota because I decided to accept 1 billion refugees.
But you are mixing nation state with nation. These are two different things.
No, no.
You are mixing nation state with nation. Democracy is not within nation. Democracy is within nation states.
Yes,
and this democracy is not so perfect. You yourself was
nothing
talking
is
about.
perfect. The only thing that is perfect is a perfect idiot. I've never met anything perfect in my life, and perfection is the enemy of the good. The number one enemy of anything good is people who seek perfection. I'm afraid of people who seek perfection. For instance, the perfect answer to poverty is communism, okay? And there is a good reason not to like it. So perfection is not even my objective. I'm trying to ask myself, within what framework, nation state, nations, within this framework, you can settle the differences you're talking about. Now, to what you have raised, which I think is enormously important. Should we have empathy? Yes, as long as empathy doesn't cost us anything. But the moment when empathy costs us, it can only have a very minor effect. For instance, are there hundreds of millions of people in the world who are persecuted? Yes. Who suffer terribly? Yes. Who are hungry? Yes. Hundreds of millions. Do we want them all in Europe? No. And anybody who will try to bring them into Europe will lose Europe to the populists. So when you say people need
But maybe we should politically and economically be engaged in these countries,
if you want
which
to have,
are
if you
on
want
the brink
to have,
to
yes,
collapse.
if you want to have a fantasy that has no basis whatsoever, that you can bring democracy to Iraq, join George Bush Jr. and bring democracy to Iraq. By the way, while you're at it, bring Gemütlichkeit to Israel. You know, there are certain things that cannot be done. And you cannot bring...
I'm not talking about military export of democracy,
but even,
did I get you right that you have an idea that democracy is exclusively something for the Western world?
Democracy is something unnatural. I'm delighted that we have adopted it. I'm delighted that we live in a bubble where this is functioning. Most of the world, it is not functioning. When most of the world says we want democracy, that basically means we want a better standard of living.
So Arabs and African people are not ready for
just
democracy?
A minute. There is a distinction. Make a distinction, for instance, between Arabs and Iranians. In the Arab world, there is so little pluralism that any attempt to bring democracy to the Arab world at the moment will inevitably fail. In Iran, on the other hand, in spite of the barbaric regime, you have a healthy society who has pluralistic attitudes, learn the culture of each nation. We are afraid to discuss culture because the moment somebody mentions culture, some idiot jumps up and says, you're a racist, and then he shuts him up. Different nations have different cultures. They're not as receptive to democracy or liberalism or open-minded pluralism as other nations. And even if they start today, think of the term it took us from the Renaissance to where we are today. It takes a few hundred years and then everything is fine. But if you want to address today the global problems at the expense of people who live in democratic states, they will vote for populists. This is what brings populists to power.
Yeah, and what do you say about this kind of cultural relativism, which...
It's not Darwinism.
I entirely disagree.
Fine. And we'll have fun.
First, I can give you many other reasons why liberals are losing and populists are winning. It has nothing to do with the nation and nation state. We can talk about this. Second, you can see, you don't want to idolize anything, but you idolize nations, and you believe somehow that nations are able to do things which other units cannot.
Some nations.
Maybe, yes, the chosen ones, yes. I come from one of those. They think they are chosen nation. But you see, look who deals with migration. These are not nations or states dealing with migration. These are major city agglomerations, urban agglomerations, which are usually multicultural, multi-ethnic, because this is where those migrants basically end up. Look at actors which generate innovation. These are, again, not nations. These are special, either enclaves like California, or again, these cities which attract legal services and financial services, and these are again melting pots, where the national agenda is of very minor importance there. Yes, states and nations are important. I believe it is correct to say that liberals paid too much emphasis on individuals and not on communities. But when we talk about those communities, these are not just nations. These are also religious. These are communities of various kind of civic associations. And I just don't see that those nations are as strong, as united, and as capable of doing things as you see this. And in particular, because for them to achieve their goals, they need a strong state. Yeah. And what the populists are doing is to destroy the state, because they have this sovereignist narrative, but in fact they undermine all pillars of strong states, which is judiciary, which is public media, which is the civil service. In Poland, the new government even appointed a director of a horse stable because he was their friend. I mean, doing those things, they basically contradict all the principle they believe in. So even if you don't think that internet has unbounded our environment, not just in economics but also military, that when you have weapons in the sky and of mass destructions, and most of attacks are cyber attacks, it's very difficult to talk about national defense. And societies also change, that you cannot have national defense like during Napoleon time. He lost 500,000 soldiers, went back to France, shouted "Viva la France," and another 500,000 wanted to be slaughtered. No, things have changed, you see. So the nations and nation-states work totally differently. They are still there. But to either idolize this as the agents of the only agents of change, I think this is simply not credible.
Maia, any comments to that before we have an all-man discussion here?
I just wanted to say that at least 1/3 of the Moldovans are already in Europe, and we don't have a big population. So if this continues, we risk to have no people at home left in a few years. And we do want to come back, or at least not to leave, because we want to have a country in the place it is now. And even though we haven't been very successful in terms of building democracy, it doesn't mean that we don't want to build democracy. And we have been having people on the streets protesting over the last 5 years, anti-corruption and for free elections and so on. But we might not be powerful enough these days because we just got some oligarchs in power who have the money, who have captured the justice, and they just use their power over justice to cancel elections. The opposition won the elections in the capital of the city, and they just decided to cancel it. We might not have enough means, and we do hope that the external world is going to help us, because there is the desire that at least half of the people in Moldova believe in democracy. Everybody wants their rights to be respected. So, and what the West can do is a different question, whether the West is being efficient or not in helping countries like mine build democracy. But I think we should not discuss the issue that some countries might not be ready or, you know, have the chance to have democracy soon enough. For instance, the biggest help that we could get is to cut the financial flows to the people who build authoritarian regimes, because they do have expensive systems that they need to maintain, and the money comes from money laundering schemes, and the dirty money comes from Russia, but then some of it goes to Europe, and I just don't see why they couldn't be investigated, the European banks or the European companies. For instance, the infamous banking sector fraud that happened in my country 3 years ago, 12% of GDP, so it's just one single transaction, 12% of GDP. Everybody knows by now the companies in the European countries which participated in this, the banks in the European countries which participated in this banking sector fraud. 12% of GDP for the poorest country of Europe, believe me, is a very dramatic experience, and no one single cent has been recovered. So, and then of course these crooks in power who are trying to kill the little democracy we have, they have lots of properties abroad in Europe, they have accounts in Europe. That would be, to my, you know, in my view, a more efficient way of helping us. Of course, we know that we need to deal with the issues, and we need to build the state ourselves, and we need to deal with corruption and fight for democracy. But there are specific things that the West can do, and we hope that the West is going to do this.
I have been reminded that we are already going to run out of time, so we have only a few minutes left for a few questions. Is this a microphone? Yes. Will anybody assist? And yeah, please.
Throw it at people.
So, we'll start with Mr. Elish. Please introduce yourself briefly.
I'm Matteo Salvini from Hungary. In each and every year, the Hungarian Prime Minister will go to a resort in Transylvania to speak about his vision. And a couple of years ago, he spoke about illiberal democracy. And since then, we are in this trap. Because, in my opinion, democracy does not need any adjective. Can you say liberal freedom and illiberal freedom? This is all, in my opinion, rubbish. But now, let me come to the question about who has the authority? Who has the authority to decide the content of democracy? And to simplify my question, if in a country which I don't want to name, any country, there is a referendum organized about the introduction of the Sharia law, and in this country, in a flawless, a free and fair election, the majority clearly decides that Sharia law should be introduced. Is it democratic or it is not democratic? If not, why not?
Okay, we will keep that question for our final round and pass the mic, please, to this gentleman.
Jaroslav Angel, Anglo-American University. Well, I wished we heard more about solutions, and we heard a little bit, but it was this kind of traditional frame of reference, top-down. And today we see all over the world different approach, bottom-up, with especially younger people. You might have heard about deliberative polling, mini-public, citizen assembly. I just came from Iceland from a conference, and there was a very intense debate about this, very hopeful signs, and so on. So my question to you is, in the spirit of this background I was talking about, there is now kind of emerging debate. We do need defend democracy, or we do need think and rebuild it. What is your point? What is your position on this question?
Okay. Other questions? Did I? Please, at the other side. Hey. Oh.
Jaroslav Hrák, I have a question to Dan. In Central Europe, there is a wave of populism, and a wave of populism. And if I look at the countries like Poland, Czech Republic, or Hungary, there is no solidarity with whomever. So how does it fit in your scheme? That's the first one. And second, if you imagine Europe without solidarity, for example, a country like Germany, if I imagine Germany living under the motto Germany first and no solidarity with Europe, I become a little bit scared. Could you comment on this?
You become what?
But I didn't get the second part. You said on the one hand and on the second hand?
The second one is for example, on Germany. So if there is no European solidarity whatsoever, and the Germans just stick to themselves and say Germany first, I become scared.
So, there's space for a last question. The lady, please. Yeah, it's coming.
My name. Actually, I disagree with this concept that there is no universal solidarity. I disagree respectfully. I understand you come from a strong country like Israel, a nation state like Israel. But I believe there is universal solidarity. If something happens like a disaster somewhere, an earthquake, don't you feel empathy for these people? You do, right? We are human beings.
So?
Also, we in Europe are very much integrated. One, in the European Union. Two, within NATO. And what is Article 5 is not, if not solidarity?
Yeah.
An attack against one is an attack against all. So I believe in the concept of international solidarity. That's what I wanted to tell you.
Thank you very much. We are coming to our final remarks. Please pick the questions you feel utmost challenged. No need to answer it by all. Would you please start, Maia?
I'll try to say a few things on the bottom-up approach, the fact that we didn't talk about solutions and that we didn't talk about the bottom-up approach. And we are witnessing a lot of good examples when the civic movements happen and people try, young people especially, try to come forward and defend the democratic processes and the liberal values. At the same time, we have to acknowledge that we have witnessed cases when this kind of revolutions, if I can use this word, have been stolen afterwards. And we had a similar situation in 2009 in my country when we got rid of the communist regime, which was there for 8 years, and then we were very happy and we thought that the change was coming. And then a few years later, we realized that this was just stolen by other corrupt politicians and nothing has happened. So I'm coming back to the idea, how do we get honest people in politics? Because this is not easy, especially in countries like mine with very weak democracy, because you almost have no honest people who would have some money there, which means you have to start a political party from scratch with no resources and to struggle, to survive, and to compete with political parties which are very rich, which use dirty money coming from all kinds of corruption schemes and so on. So I think this is what we need to ensure, that there should be a transition from the well-intentioned movements of defending these values to then governments, politicians who would pursue this. Who would pursue this if you get the same kind of corrupt politicians? So it's a vicious cycle. We need to find ways to encourage decent people, young people to get into politics, but the tough conditions are there. I'm somebody who has been doing full-time voluntary work for 2 years because I work for a political party. I'm the chairwoman of a political party which is the second most popular, but which has just one employee because its annual budget is just 25,000 euros. It might sound ridiculous to you, but this is the only money that we could legally collect through donations in a country like mine, because you have a government which is very oppressive, with everybody else who would make a contribution to the opposition political party. So I think this is where we need to actually think of. If we want better politicians, we need to think how they can emerge and survive.
Thanks a lot. Dan.
Well,
final remarks.
First of all, thank you for the question about solutions. I don't ever speak about solutions, only crossword puzzles have solutions. I'm speaking about response. And the response of liberalism, and I think the crisis is that of liberalism, should have 4 points. The first is not to negate the nationalism, because if you do it, you lose the trust of the people. The second is to progress with liberal ideas in accordance with the digestibility of these liberal ideas. Because if you go for liberal ideas who cannot be digested by your people, you will give the floor for the populists. The third is, because everybody thinks, and this is also an answer in a way to your question here, everybody thinks that he should come first. And I have no problem with it, provided you say, I'm first, but not last. In other words, and here I come to something that you said, it will be in my benefit to do something for others at a digestible rate. Again, digestible for me is the key word, because if it is indigestible, we get the populists. And the last but not least would be to convince the people, and what we want is not to have a good argument. We want to take power again, okay? So convince the people that you really understand their concerns and their fear, and that you're willing to do something about it. Because the #1 problem is alienation. And I think that this needs to be bridged. Concerning this question, should I stop here? Okay.
We're running out of time. Thank you very much. Jan.
I'd rather believe in public interest, in democracy, than national interest. And public interests, of course, have to be negotiated. So there's nothing like an abstract level of, you know, what is digestible or not. We have to negotiate together. And on that basis, we will come with a solution. The problem is, the reasons why we haven't reformed democratic institutions is not because we were lazy or complacent. It is because behind all arrangements, there is power, money, glory. And of course, when you don't reform formal institutions, informal take over, and you know the rest. People are suspicious about informal networks within countries or within Europe. You know, this is where we are. And it's the only irony that internet, for instance, is used by anti-establishment forces like Podemos or Five-Star Movement, while the liberals usually ridicule those experiments. But we have to do something, because exactly for the reasons these nationalities are not simple, these solidarities within nations are not simple, and they are increasing transnational. I don't want to say, you see, that tomorrow we will have equivalent of international proletarian or precariat in the new form. No, I don't believe in that. But I believe there are a lot of problems which bring people together, from climate change to internet revolution and so on, and we'll have to deal with them. And, but I believe that this could be done on different levels, because on the local, national, and transnational. And I believe that those who, you know, I understand why they criticize, for instance, European or global level, because it was very often dysfunctional. It was very dysfunctional. You have European Council, these people, you know, adopt communique, make pictures, send reassuring tweets, and they don't solve any problems or make things worse. So I understand why people were disappointed. But let's not forget who runs the European Union. Nation states run the European Union. And the populist argument is a fraud, I try to say, and I give you to finish one example. I learned it with my first and last meeting with Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage came to Oxford for Oxford Union debate, and somebody introduced, this is organized by students, and they introduced me to Farage. And they said, oh, this is Jan Zielonka, he teaches European politics here in Oxford. And Farage looked at me and said, oh, you are one of those people taking money from Brussels, this Jean Monnet professor. I said, no, Mr. Farage, it is you who is taking money from Brussels. I'm paid by my university. You see, that is the fraud, you know, which I contest. So let's get serious.
Thanks a lot. I think at least we had a lively controversy, partly. And I finally would just come back to your question, is it about defending or is it about rebuilding democracies? Now, if liberal democracy is under attack from within and from without, we have to defend it. But of course you are right that defending democracy is not just sticking to the status quo and trying to preserve the status quo. We are, and Jan has been talking about that in his final remarks, we are confronted with fundamental challenges which are changing our world and changing the life of every citizen. It's globalization, it's the digital revolution, it's climate change, global migration. And liberal democracies will not only survive, but will win back their momentum if they prove that they are able to deal successfully with these challenges and with these fundamental changes done globally. So we have to strengthen our capacity to shape reality in a proactive way. This was the promise of democracy. Yeah? And to renew our social contract, but this would be a new long debate. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.